For millennia, humanity has whispered of beings who twist desire and longing into an absolute weapon. They are not mindless, grotesque things born of the grave, but creatures sculpted from pure, intoxicating allure. They are the ultimate predator of the lonely. Tonight we speak of the Enchantress. She is the ultimate illusion, the perfect mirror of your most secret want. Her voice is a hypnotic, silvery current, promising peace and fulfillment in exchange for something you deem utterly worthless. But she consumes not blood or flesh. She consumes the very foundational identity of her targets, the emotional anchor that connects them to the human world. She leaves behind only the empty shell of a person, a sudden, permanent vanishing of the soul. She targets those who are already adrift, the solitary, the profoundly regretful, the people who secretly believe they deserve to be lost. Tonight, we step off the academic path and into the chilling personal account known as "She asked for a name, I gave her a soul," the Enchantress.
I was always a creature of the periphery. A cartographer who preferred the forgotten dirt roads to the paved arteries of modern life. It's a precise job, one that values objective truth above all else. I appreciate the deep security of knowing exactly where you are, and more importantly, where you are not. I deal in absolutes, in the unmoving certainty of longitude and latitude. But my need for certainty was not just professional, it was a psychological shield. I sought isolation because I was running from the messy, subjective truth of my own past. 3 years ago, my sister, Eleanor, my only family, my anchor, had faced a crisis. A medical scare, something serious. I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to fly home. But an assignment, a ridiculous, high-paying, remote assignment in the Andes, had interfered. I prioritized the job, the certainty of the paycheck, over the uncertainty of her fear. She recovered, but the betrayal was irreversible. When I returned, she was colder, the light gone from her eyes when she looked at me. The bond was frayed. There was a secret, deeply intimate nickname I had given her as a child, a word that represented our unbreakable connection. Little Star. After I let her down, I never used it again. It became a sacred, guarded, poisoned memory, a constant reminder of my failure. It was the deepest wound on my internal map, and I sought refuge where no emotional reality could touch me. My assignment in the Oaks of Blackwater, deep in rural New England, was exactly that refuge. The Oaks are a stretch of forest so vast, so primeval. The locals, who are sparse enough, don't bother naming its sections. They just call it the Blighted Grove and cross themselves. It was an area of sprawling, almost medieval density, untouched by modern signals or infrastructure. My job was simple: map the unmapped trails, log the elevation, and confirm the boundaries for a potential conservation effort. I went in with a full rig, professional-grade GPS, 2 compasses, 1 magnetic, 1 optical, satellite phone, and 4 weeks of supplies. I was the master of my external reality. But as soon as I crossed the first marked boundary, I felt a familiar, creeping dread. The air became heavy, thick with the scent of pine, damp soil, copper, and something indefinable. A faint, lingering sweetness, floral and ancient, that defied the simple decomposition of nature. The silence here was not restful. It was watchful. It was the kind of silence that suggests 1,000 noises have been deliberately absorbed by a greater entity. The crunch of my own footsteps was unnaturally loud, and the sound of the nearby creek, water, thin, dark, and smelling faintly of minerals, seemed to dissipate within a few feet. I was entering an acoustic black hole. This forest was not designed for the introspection of a man on the run. It was designed for the isolation of a man who was already lost. I spent 6 days establishing my base camp. This process, normally 3 days, was intentionally prolonged. I was savoring the solitude, transforming it from a job requirement into a philosophical statement. I don't need the world. During those days, I began to perceive the forest not as a collection of trees, but as a colossal, breathing, unified host. Day 3. The map that moves. The first true sign of anomaly was the cartography itself. I had spent hours meticulously logging a series of elevation points along a difficult ridge. The data was locked in my GPS and plotted on my grid paper. The next morning, I rechecked the markers. My GPS coordinates were correct, mathematically certain. But when I compared them to my grid map, 3 distinct points, all forming a recognizable triangle, had moved. Not moved on the paper. The ink was dry. But relative to the surrounding topography, the grid lines I had drawn to connect them now seemed stretched, distorted, and subtly rotated. It defied geometry. It suggested that the very canvas of reality had warped while I slept. I checked and rechecked the optical sighting, concluding I must have been exhausted. I redrew the section, but the unnerving sensation of dealing with a geography that was fluid, not fixed, lingered like a phantom pain. My external certainty was failing me. Day 4. The sound of nothing. The environmental anomalies intensified. I encountered an old ranger, a grizzled man named Elias, on a distant, unmarked perimeter line. He was packing up his truck, his eyes wide and hollow. "You the map man?" he croaked, never quite meeting my gaze. "Arthur Vane? Yes." "Get out of here, Vane. You map the things that are. This place, it maps the things that aren't." I pressed him, but he just shook his head, looking terrified. The silence. It comes first, then the music, a little melody. You listen to it, and you forget why you started listening. You forget the middle of a thought. You forget why you came out here in the first place. He drove away quickly, leaving me with a sense of irrational fear. I never saw or heard of Ranger Elias again. That night, the cicadas, the owls, the wind, everything stopped. The silence I had experienced before was merely a lull. This was an absolute vacuum. It was the sound of sound being murdered. The pressure in my ears intensified, and I could hear the wet, heavy thudding of my own heart in my chest. The floral, ancient smell intensified, like a bouquet left to wilt in a copper vase. Then, just as Elias had warned, the music began. Not loud, but exquisitely faint, woven into the edges of my hearing. It was a melody of profound longing, beautiful and infinitely sad, like a forgotten lullaby. It sounded exactly like the music I used to listen to alone in my room when I felt the crushing weight of loneliness after I had disappointed Eleanor. I immediately dismissed it as auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the silence. But it had found a specific tuning fork in my personal history. Day 5. The reflection. I decided to leave the next morning. The job wasn't worth the psychic toll. I packed my most essential gear, leaving the heavy surveying equipment. As I crossed the creek, the same dark, coppery water, I glanced down. The water was shallow, clear. I saw my reflection, a tired, bearded man. But for a flicker of a second, the reflection was wrong. It wasn't distorted by the water's surface. It was distorted by its own profound sadness. The reflected Arthur Vane looked back at me, not with fatigue, but with a horrifying, utter resignation. A man who had already given up the fight. I scrambled back from the bank, my heart pounding. I was no longer seeing precursors. I was seeing confirmation. I was in a place that mapped the absence of things, and I was the subject. I stopped packing. I couldn't leave. The forest had become a psychological cage. To leave now would be to admit the fear was real. The cartographer must always be certain. I convinced myself I would stay one more day to finalize my objective data, to prove the map was solid. It was the evening of the 6th day. I sat in my tent, lightheaded and nauseous, drinking weak tea and trying to reconcile the data on my charts. The absolute silence had returned, and with it, the pervasive floral copper scent. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, exactly where Elias's abandoned truck would have been parked. She was not merely beautiful, she was the impossible crystallization of desire. Her dress was the color of slate, but it flowed like liquid silver, catching the weak twilight and refusing to reflect it. Her hair, impossibly dark, framed a face of such perfect, unmarred symmetry that it was terrifying. It lacked the necessary flaws that make a human face trustworthy. And her eyes. They were the color of molten gold seen through a dark filter, large and profoundly deep. They did not blink. They simply rested on me. And in that gaze, I felt completely, utterly stripped bare. She didn't need to read my palm. She was reading the detailed, unedited map of my self-loathing. I froze, locked in place by an invisible gravitational pull. The primordial part of my brain was screaming, "Flee." This is an apex predator. But the rational part of my brain, the part driven by the need for certainty and rest, was intoxicated. She took a slow, deliberate step toward me. "You carry too much, cartographer," she whispered. Her voice was the music I had heard earlier, a melody of profound comfort, but amplified, resonating in my bones. "You chart the boundaries of the world, but you failed to map the boundaries of your own despair." I was unable to move. I was breathing in short, shallow gasps. "I am the answer to your most burdensome questions," she continued, her voice growing stronger, warmer, infinitely persuasive. "But every answer requires payment. Always." What do you want?" I managed, my voice a pathetic squeak. She smiled. The expression was beautiful, but her eyes remained cold and professional. "I have no need of your blood, or your paltry gold. I have no need of your knowledge of elevations. I need what you consider worthless, and what you guard most fiercely." She began to walk the perimeter of my small clearing, slowly, elegantly. The ground seemed to recoil from her touch. "You are a mind of excellent construction. You have thousands of memories, 1,000 tiny fears. All very delicious," she mused. "But your true currency is your failure. The memory of your sister, of the promise you broke. That regret is why you are here. That regret is the only thing that weighs you down. And I can take it away. I can give you absolute, permanent, silent peace." She stopped directly in front of me, her face inches from mine. I could smell the floral, ancient sweetness intensely now. "I offer you 3 gifts," she whispered, raising 3 delicate fingers. "You may choose one as your payment, and I will grant you the night of peace. 1. The gift of absolute truth. The objective, unvarnished truth about your sister's ailment and whether your absence truly mattered. You will know if you are guilty or merely a victim of circumstance. 2. The gift of total peace. The permanent removal of the agonizing weight you carry. The regret will simply cease to exist. You will be free. 3. The gift of reconnection. The name of your truest enemy in this world. The person who wishes you ruin. You will have certainty, and you will be safe." I stared at her, overwhelmed. The gifts were profound. The price, however, was still the same. "I only require one thing from you in payment," she reiterated, her eyes boring into my own. "A single name. A name that you have given to another person. A private, intimate label. A name that has meaning to you, but which you believe is ultimately disposable and useless to anyone else." My mind raced. A name, a label, a random password. What is the harm, I thought. I'll give her the name of an old professor I hated, the name of my first boat. But she seemed to read the ledger in my mind. She shook her head, an almost imperceptible movement. "No, that has no emotional weight. It must be something precious, something guarded, something you consider unnecessary to your survival, but which holds the key to your self-identity." My gaze immediately snapped to the locked room in my mind where I kept the name. "Little Star." "It's just a word," I pleaded with myself. My sister recovered. "It's just a silly childhood nickname. I haven't used it in 3 years. It's a lockbox of failure. If I hand it over, maybe the memory itself will be sterilized. Maybe I'll finally get rid of the guilt." The thought was intoxicating. It was the ultimate cartographic solution. Erase the point of failure. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I chose the second gift. "I choose total peace. Take the weight away." She smiled wider, a smile of profound, ancient satisfaction. "And your payment?" My voice was barely a whisper. I was handing over the most sacred thing I owned, convinced it was an obsolete key to an unwanted room. "It is Little Star," I confessed. "My sister, That is what I called her. The moment the name left my lips, the air around her seemed to shimmer. Her eyes closed momentarily, and I heard a sound. Not a human sound, but a sound like a vast, empty vault being locked shut, followed by a sound like a single, exquisitely tuned chord being plucked and then silenced forever. She opened her eyes. The hunger was gone, replaced by a cold, functional finality. "Thank you, cartographer. Your debt is paid. Now rest." The exhaustion that hit me was total. It was the surrender of all my defenses, the final release of all psychological tension. I collapsed onto the ground, sinking into a sleep deeper and more silent than any I had ever known. I awoke the next morning to the bright, cheerful sound of birdsong. The sun was streaming through the canopy. The silence was gone. I was, exactly as promised, refreshed. A profound, utterly complete sense of peace settled over me. I felt light, empty, and strangely efficient. The feeling of guilt, the deep regret over Eleanor, was simply gone. It hadn't been replaced by joy. It had been replaced by a neutral, clinical acknowledgement that the past was merely a collection of data points. I packed my camp with a focus and precision I hadn't felt in years. I finalized my map data, confirming the coordinates were correct, and drove out of the Oaks of Blackwater. The psychological horror began 48 hours later, back in the city, when I was completely out of the forest's gravitational field. My first priority was Eleanor. I called her apartment. She picked up on the second ring. "Hello?" she said, bright and professional. "Eleanor, it's me, Arthur. Just wanted to see how you're doing." "Oh, hello, Mr. Vane," she replied. Mr. Vane. The sound was a hammer blow. "I'm doing well, thank you. To what do I owe the call?" My blood ran cold. "It's Arthur, your brother. Don't you recognize my voice?" "I don't believe I have a brother, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice genuinely confused but polite. "I've been an only child since childhood. I'm sorry, but you must have the wrong person." Wait, Eleanor. It's Little Star. Remember when Dad used to take us to the lake and we'd call ourselves Little Star and the Surveyor?" I was shouting the sacred name now, desperate to force the lock. There was a long silence on the line. Then, her voice returned, flat, professional, and utterly disconnected. "I sincerely apologize, but that name holds absolutely no significance for me. Are you perhaps experiencing distress? If so, I recommend you contact a professional." And she hung up. I sat there, gripping the receiver, the peace I felt replaced by a clinical terror. The Enchantress hadn't taken the memory of me. She had taken the emotional currency attached to my existence. She had stolen the significance of Little Star from my sister's mind, and with it, the emotional context of our entire history. To Eleanor, I was simply an unfamiliar voice, a fact without feeling. I drove immediately to the home of Robert, my closest friend, my confidant since grade school. I needed his validation. He opened the door, smiled warmly, and offered me a beer. "Arthur Vane, it's great to see you. How was the wilderness trip?" I felt a surge of relief. "Robbie, thank God. I had the strangest experience." "Robert," he interrupted, with a puzzled look. "It's Robert, Arthur. Robbie is my son." I forced a laugh. "Come on, man. I've called you Robbie since high school. Remember the time we drove the old Chevy?" "Yes, the old Chevy," he said, nodding vaguely. "A memorable experience. But I prefer Robert. It's more fitting now, wouldn't you agree? I'm 42, Arthur. No longer a Robbie." I pressed him further, desperately trying to invoke shared intimacy. "Do you remember the night you told me about your engagement to Sarah? You were so nervous, you kept calling her?" He cut me off with an unnerving politeness. "Yes, I remember the conversation. We discussed the logistics of the proposal. It was a stressful time. I appreciate you listening." He remembered the facts. He remembered the logistics. But the emotional core, the shared vulnerability, the trembling fear, the joy of a friend, was erased. He was remembering a scheduled business meeting, not a late-night confession between brothers. The intimacy was gone, replaced by a functional, academic record of our history. Over the next few weeks, the systemic nature of the erasure became clear. I called my former supervisor, a man who had been a mentor and often used the affectionate epithet, map maker, for me. He answered my call professionally, addressing me repeatedly as Mr. Vane. He remembered my employment history, my performance reviews, and my projects, all the quantifiable data. But when I tried to evoke a shared memory, he would listen patiently, then respond with a generic, polite platitude. Yes, that was a successful project. You handled the challenges professionally. I visited my old favorite coffee shop. The barista, Maria, who I had seen every day for 5 years and who always knew my order, a complex triple-shot Americano, looked at me blankly. "What can I get for you?" she asked. When I described my usual drink, she wrote it down carefully. She had lost the unconditional recognition, the simple daily acknowledgement of my unique identity that makes up the fabric of belonging. The Enchantress hadn't just stolen the name Little Star. She had stolen the emotional framework of my life. She used that name as the master key to unlock and sterilize the feelings, the inside jokes, the shared history, the private language, everything that made me Arthur to them. I was left with a history that was factual, but entirely meaningless. I was a detailed map with no legend. I realized I was an anomaly, a man whose life history was universally acknowledged, yet personally denied. I was a ghost who could still operate machinery. I was functionally alive, but spiritually dead. The peace I had been promised was the peace of a sterile operating theater. There was no more regret because there was no more capacity for deep feeling. The emotional anchor to Eleanor, to Robert, to my past, was severed. I was free of my burden, but I was also free of love, intimacy, and belonging. I began to run tests. I would walk up to strangers and tell them an intensely personal story about my childhood. They would listen and offer a sympathetic, generic reply. I would then tell the same story to Robert or Eleanor. They would nod, remember the facts of the story, and then dismiss it with the same emotional indifference. I could no longer move them. I could no longer connect with them. The cruelest realization came one night as I sat alone in my apartment, looking at an old photograph of Eleanor and me laughing. I tried, with all my might, to feel the specific, crushing wave of guilt I used to feel about my failure to be there for her. I wanted the pain back. I wanted the weight. I screamed "Little Star" into the empty room. And I felt nothing. The word was inert. The image of her face remained, but the emotional electricity, the love, the guilt, the intimacy, was gone. The Enchantress had not just removed the feeling from them, she had removed the capacity for that feeling from me. I was the ultimate cartographer now. I could map the emotional distances of others with chilling accuracy, knowing exactly how many degrees of separation lay between me and the people I loved. But I could no longer bridge the gap. I have become the perfect example of the Enchantress's power. I narrate this not as a warning, but as a clinical confession, a blueprint of her operation. My tone is monotone, detached, and academic, proving that the creature has won. I am now a functional stranger, the cartographer of my own profound, permanent death of spirit. The story of the Enchantress remains universal and utterly terrifying. Her persistence is testament to the one psychological truth she exploits. The deepest desire of the human heart is not for gold or power, but for unconditional recognition and belonging. She offers a night of peace, a moment of perfect validation, and in return, she takes the very thing that made the victim worthy of that recognition in the first place. And this brings us to the final, necessary uncertainty. You have heard the story. You know her method. You have been warned against the beautiful promises and the insignificant costs. You feel safe. You believe you know the creature. You believe you now hold certainty, the absolute knowledge of how to avoid her trap. But what if this profile, this entire terrifying account, was not crafted as a warning? What if it was constructed as a template? The legends state that the Enchantress feeds on the meaning of words, the significance of connection. She seeks the hidden vulnerabilities, the tokens of love and connection that keep a person whole. You now possess the entire blueprint of her operation. This knowledge, this profile you hold in your mind right now, has given you one thing: absolute, unshakable certainty. And certainty, above all things, is the most predictable vulnerability. Ask yourself as you close your eyes tonight, has the Enchantress vanished? Or has she simply ensured that the next person she encounters, the one who knows how the game is played, will be the most exquisite, most confident, and thus, the most easily afflicted target of all? You are prepared now. You have the map. And the greatest tragedy of the cartographer is realizing that the map, once finished, is a trap. Good night, and may your most precious connections remain safe from the price of a single word.